August 6th, 1945. Hiroshima wakes beneath a clear summer sky. Streetcars begin their morning routes. Factory workers and students move through narrow streets toward assigned labor sites. The Ota River glints under early sunlight. Air raid alarms had sounded often in recent months, yet this morning feels unusually calm. No major bombing raids have struck the city. Many believe Hiroshima has somehow been spared. At 8:15 a.m., a single American B-29 bomber passes high overhead, almost unnoticed. Seconds later, a blinding flash consumes the sky. Temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun erupt at the city's center. Buildings dissolve. Shadows burn into stone. Tens of thousands die in an instant. But the true horror does not end with the explosion. Days later, survivors begin collapsing without visible wounds. Skin darkens, hair falls out, fever spreads through crowded shelters. Photographs taken in the ruins soon reveal a new and invisible enemy: radiation. And to understand why Hiroshima became the stage for this unprecedented event, we must first look at the war that brought the world to this moment. By 1945, the Second World War had entered its final and most brutal phase. In Europe, Nazi Germany was collapsing under the combined pressure of Soviet forces advancing from the east and Allied armies pushing from the west. Berlin would fall in May. Victory in Europe seemed assured. But across the Pacific, the war raged on with unrelenting ferocity. Since the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the conflict between Imperial Japan and the United States had spread across vast ocean distances, from the jungles of Southeast Asia to remote Pacific islands. Each battle demanded enormous sacrifice: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima. Every advance toward Japan came at staggering cost. Japanese forces, guided by a doctrine that emphasized death over surrender, fought with desperate determination. Kamikaze pilots launched suicide attacks against Allied ships. Civilians were often drawn into combat zones. American commanders anticipated that any invasion of Japan itself would be even more catastrophic. The Battle of Okinawa, fought between April and June 1945, reinforced those fears. More than 12,000 American soldiers were killed. Japanese military casualties exceeded 70,000, and tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians died amid bombardment and ground combat. The island, only 340 miles from the Japanese mainland, became a grim preview of what an invasion might look like. Allied planners prepared Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. Estimates of casualties varied widely, but many military leaders expected hundreds of thousands of Allied deaths and possibly millions of Japanese casualties, including civilians mobilized to resist invasion. At the same time, American bombers intensified conventional attacks on Japanese cities. Beginning in early 1945, B-29 Superfortress bombers launched devastating firebombing campaigns. On the night of March 9th to 10th, Tokyo endured one of the most destructive air raids in history. Firestorms swept through wooden residential districts, killing an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night. Dozens of other cities suffered similar attacks. Urban infrastructure collapsed. Transportation networks were crippled. Food shortages spread. Yet Japan's leadership continued fighting, hoping to secure better surrender terms or draw the Soviet Union into mediating peace. Meanwhile, in absolute secrecy, a different kind of weapon was nearing completion. Since 1942, the United States had led the Manhattan Project, a vast scientific and industrial effort to build an atomic bomb before Nazi Germany could achieve the same breakthrough. Research facilities spread across the country, uranium enrichment at Oak Ridge, plutonium production at Hanford, and bomb design laboratories at Los Alamos under physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. The project employed more than 130,000 people, most unaware of the weapon's true purpose. Scientists struggled with unprecedented engineering and theoretical challenges, racing against time and uncertainty. By mid-1945, the first successful nuclear test occurred in the New Mexico desert on July 16th, in an event codenamed Trinity. The explosion exceeded expectations. Humanity had entered the atomic age. President Harry S. Truman, informed of the successful test while attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany, now faced a decision that would define modern history. Allied leaders demanded Japan's unconditional surrender through the Potsdam Declaration issued on July 26th, warning of prompt and utter destruction if Japan refused. Japanese authorities did not immediately accept the terms. American military planners began preparing to use the new weapon in hopes of ending the war swiftly and avoiding invasion. A target committee evaluated possible cities. Criteria included military significance, urban size, and the desire for minimal previous bombing damage to measure the bomb's impact clearly. Several cities were considered: Kyoto, Kokura, Niigata, and Hiroshima. Kyoto, despite its size, was eventually removed due to its cultural importance. Hiroshima remained a primary candidate. The city housed military headquarters, supply depots, and troop concentrations. It had also been largely spared earlier bombing raids, leaving its infrastructure intact. A grimly ideal condition for demonstrating the bomb's destructive power. And while military planners finalized their decisions, civilians in Hiroshima continued their daily routines, unaware that forces already in motion would soon unleash devastation beyond anything previously seen in warfare. Devastation whose true effects would only begin to reveal themselves after the smoke cleared. In the early seconds after the atomic bomb detonated 600 meters above Hiroshima, the city effectively ceased to function as an organized urban space. The blast wave traveled outward faster than sound, crushing buildings, overturning vehicles, and throwing people through walls and across streets. Within moments, fires ignited across thousands of locations simultaneously. Nearly 70% of the city's structures were destroyed or severely damaged. Wooden homes, factories, schools, hospitals. Most collapsed or burned, bridges twisted, telephone lines vanished, roads were blocked by debris and bodies. Survivors, many burned and bleeding, wandered in shock through landscapes they no longer recognized. Hiroshima's communication systems failed instantly. Military headquarters inside the city stopped transmitting. Railway lines went silent. For hours, Japanese authorities outside Hiroshima could not determine what had happened. Pilots sent to investigate reported a vast cloud rising over the region and a city consumed by smoke. On the ground, chaos ruled. Tens of thousands who survived the blast suffered severe burns. Clothing ignited from thermal radiation, skin peeled from bodies. Many staggered toward rivers seeking relief from unbearable heat, only to drown from exhaustion or injury. Others lay trapped under collapsed structures, calling for help that rarely arrived. Hospitals and clinics were destroyed or overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses were themselves among the casualties. Medical supplies burned. Rescue efforts depended on surviving soldiers, students, and civilians who struggled to assist the injured without equipment or training. By afternoon, enormous fires merged into firestorms, consuming what remained of entire neighborhoods. Hot winds fed the flames. Oxygen vanished in burning districts. Those sheltering indoors suffocated or burned alive as fires swept through ruined buildings. As night fell, a strange rain began to fall over parts of the city. Thick, dark droplet carrying soot, dust, and radioactive particles drawn into the mushroom cloud and returning to Earth. Survivors later remembered it as black rain. Many, desperate for water after hours in intense heat, drank it without knowing its contamination. During the following days, rescue teams from neighboring areas entered Hiroshima. What they encountered defied prior experience of warfare. Bodies lay everywhere, along roads, inside streetcars, beneath collapsed houses. Burn victims lined makeshift aid stations. Thousands wandered in silence, faces swollen, clothes shredded, skin hanging from arms. At first, many injuries appeared survivable. People with few visible wounds sought treatment. Yet something deeply puzzling soon emerged. Men, women, and children who had seemed stable suddenly weakened. Fever developed. Vomiting began. Purple spots appeared beneath skin. Hair started falling out in clumps. Gums bled uncontrollably. Wounds refused to heal. Doctors, unfamiliar with radiation sickness, struggled to explain these symptoms. Some believed it was infection or exhaustion. Others suspected exposure to unknown gases or chemicals. No previous bomb had caused illness days after an explosion. In temporary shelters, survivors watched neighbors deteriorate rapidly. Entire families who escaped the blast succumbed in the following weeks. Fear spread alongside illness. Rumors circulated that a mysterious poison had been released. Japanese scientists slowly concluded that a new type of bomb had been used. News reports from abroad confirmed it. An atomic bomb powered by nuclear fission. But understanding the lingering effects of radiation would take much longer. In the ruins of Hiroshima, photographers, military survey teams, and later international observers began documenting what they saw. Among burned buildings and shattered streets, cameras captured images of survivors whose injuries revealed the unseen force unleashed on the city. Evidence that would soon shock the world. And these images, along with the experiences of those who lived through the catastrophe, would shape how humanity came to understand the hidden consequences of nuclear warfare. In the weeks following the bombing, survivors moved through landscapes that no longer resembled their former neighborhoods. Entire districts had vanished. Familiar streets became open fields of ash and twisted debris. Families searched desperately for relatives among temporary shelters and burned remains. Photographs taken during this period show people whose suffering was not always immediately visible. Some walked with bandaged arms and faces, their skin burned by thermal radiation. Others appeared outwardly unharmed, yet soon collapsed from unseen internal damage. Children wandered alone, orphaned within minutes of the blast. Many survivors wore makeshift clothing fashioned from scraps after their garments burned away. One recurring image shows long lines of injured civilians waiting silently for treatment outside destroyed medical facilities. There are few signs of panic in these images. Instead, exhaustion dominates. Faces appear expressionless, as though shock has drained emotion itself. Survivors later described a strange quiet settling over the city. With buildings gone and transportation destroyed, normal urban noise disappeared. Only the crackling of fires and distant cries interrupted the silence. People moved slowly, conserving energy, often unaware that their health was already deteriorating. In these photographs, humanity appears suspended between survival and collapse. individuals enduring suffering they could neither see nor understand, revealing that the bomb's destruction extended far beyond the instant of explosion. And doctors attempting to treat these survivors soon discovered that many injuries could not be explained by burns or trauma alone. Medical workers who survived the blast immediately faced overwhelming challenges. Hiroshima's major hospitals lay near the explosion's center and were destroyed. Thousands of injured civilians arrived at makeshift aid stations, staffed by wounded doctors and nurses working without supplies. At first, treatment focused on burns and fractures. Yet within days, unusual symptoms began appearing among patients who initially seemed stable. Survivors developed high fevers, fatigue, vomiting, and diarrhea. Purple hemorrhagic spots appeared under the skin. Hair began falling out in handfuls. Gums bled, and minor wounds became fatal infections. Doctors struggled to understand what they were witnessing. Many believed patients suffered from malnutrition or infection caused by unsanitary conditions. But the pattern was too widespread and too sudden. Medical records compiled in the weeks after the bombing describe entire hospital wards where patients died without visible injury. Some survivors who appeared healthy on arrival deteriorated rapidly and died within days. Blood tests later revealed severe damage to bone marrow, preventing the body from producing white blood cells needed to fight infection. The concept of radiation sickness was largely theoretical before Hiroshima. Now physicians were confronting its consequences directly, without prior knowledge or treatment options. Medical teams documented symptoms carefully, knowing they were observing something unprecedented. Their notes and later photographs would become some of the earliest evidence revealing how radiation affected the human body long after the explosion itself. And while doctors struggled to treat victims, photographers arriving in the devastated city began recording scenes that would later force the world to confront what had truly happened in Hiroshima. In the days and weeks after the bombing, Japanese photographers and military survey teams cautiously entered Hiroshima to document the destruction. Among them were individuals such as Yoshito Matsushige, one of the few photographers who managed to capture images within hours of the explosion. Matsushige later described being so overwhelmed by what he saw that he hesitated to take photographs, feeling almost ashamed to point a camera at suffering civilians. His images show wounded survivors sitting along bridges, their bodies wrapped in cloth, faces swollen and burned. Later, Japanese and Allied photographers documented entire districts flattened into dust. Images revealed people covered in bandages, patients receiving treatment outdoors, and survivors with severe burns patterned by clothing or objects that shielded parts of their bodies. However, many of these images remained unseen internationally for years. During the American occupation of Japan, strict censorship limited publication of photographs showing radiation injuries and devastation. Authorities feared public reaction and concerns over nuclear warfare's moral implications. As restrictions eased in later years, these images gradually emerged, becoming some of the most powerful visual records of war's human consequences. They showed not only destruction, but also resilience, survivors attempting to rebuild lives amid ruins. Yet photographs captured only part of the story. Behind the visible injuries lay deeper scientific, political, and moral consequences that continued unfolding long after cameras recorded the shattered city. And as researchers and governments began examining the long-term effects of radiation exposure, Hiroshima's tragedy expanded from a local catastrophe into a global turning point. In the months following Japan's surrender in August 1945, scientists from both Japan and the United States began systematic investigations into what had happened inside Hiroshima. Initially, many military planners believed the bomb's damage ended with the explosion and fires, but medical evidence suggested otherwise. Japanese doctors had already observed delayed deaths among survivors who showed few injuries immediately after the blast. Now, international research teams sought to understand why. In late 1945 and early 1946, American scientific teams entered Hiroshima and Nagasaki to measure radiation levels and study survivors. These investigations later evolved into the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, or ABCC, established in 1947. Their mission focused on studying long-term health consequences among survivors, who came to be known as Hibakusha, bomb-affected people. Researchers documented patterns of radiation sickness, bone marrow destruction, immune system collapse, hair loss, bleeding disorders, and later increases in leukemia and other cancers. Survivors exposed closer to the blast showed higher mortality rates, while those shielded by buildings or terrain sometimes survived with fewer injuries. Scientists also learned that radiation damage did not end quickly. Some survivors developed illnesses years later. Children exposed in the womb experienced developmental complications. Genetic consequences became a subject of global study and debate. Photographs and medical records became crucial tools. Images showing burns, scarring, and later keloid formations helped doctors categorize radiation injuries. These studies would later influence radiation safety standards worldwide, shaping policies in medicine, nuclear energy, and military planning. But while scientific understanding advanced, political concerns shaped how much of this information reached the public. And beyond laboratories and hospitals, governments struggled with how the world should interpret what the atomic bomb had introduced. After Japan's surrender in September 1945, the country came under Allied occupation led by General Douglas MacArthur. American authorities controlled communication, press publications, and film production throughout occupied Japan. Among occupation policies was strict censorship concerning atomic bomb coverage. Newspapers, magazines, and filmmakers were prohibited from publishing detailed accounts or images showing radiation injuries or extensive destruction. Film footage shot in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was confiscated or restricted. Official justifications centered on preventing unrest and controlling sensitive military information. However, historians later argued that authorities also sought to manage international reaction to nuclear warfare and prevent widespread fear or criticism. As a result, many photographs documenting radiation effects remained unseen outside Japan for years. Survivors' testimonies circulated locally but rarely reached global audiences during the immediate post-war period. When censorship restrictions eased in the early 1950s after occupation ended, suppressed images and survivor stories began appearing internationally. Audiences encountering these photographs for the first time were confronted not only with destroyed cities, but with suffering that extended long after combat ended. Public awareness gradually shifted nuclear weapons from symbols of military victory to sources of existential fear. Images of scarred survivors challenged triumphant narratives surrounding the bomb's use. And as those images spread, humanity began confronting difficult moral questions about warfare itself. The photographs emerging from Hiroshima forced observers to reconsider what modern warfare had become. Previous bombings destroyed cities through prolonged campaigns. Hiroshima demonstrated that a single weapon could annihilate an urban center within seconds, while leaving invisible suffering that persisted for decades. Debates emerged almost immediately. Some argued the bomb prevented greater casualties by ending the war quickly and avoiding invasion. Others questioned whether civilian populations should ever become targets of such overwhelming force. Survivors themselves carried conflicting emotions. Many focused on rebuilding their lives rather than entering political debates. Yet as their illnesses and scars remained visible reminders, Hibakusha voices gradually became central to global anti-nuclear movements. Rare images of radiation victims became symbols not only of tragedy, but of warning. Museums, documentaries, and educational programs began presenting these photographs to illustrate nuclear warfare's consequences beyond immediate destruction. By the late 20th century, Hiroshima stood not merely as a wartime event, but as a moral landmark. The city rebuilt itself into a center advocating nuclear disarmament and peace education, preserving survivor testimony and historical documentation. And as the world entered the Cold War, the destructive power first revealed in Hiroshima evolved into something even more dangerous. An arms race capable of threatening all humanity, setting the stage for the moment when the true global implications of atomic warfare became undeniable. In the first days after the bombing, attention focused on immediate devastation. Entire neighborhoods had burned away. Tens of thousands were dead. Rescue efforts struggled simply to provide food, water, and shelter for survivors. But by mid-August 1945, something far more alarming began unfolding inside overcrowded aid stations and temporary hospitals. Patients who initially appeared stable suddenly worsened. Survivors who walked into clinics days earlier now lay weak and feverish. Doctors observed uncontrollable bleeding from gums and noses. Bruises spread beneath the skin without injury. Hair fell out in clumps. Many victims became too weak to stand. Medical workers could offer little explanation. Traditional treatments failed. Antibiotics were scarce. Blood transfusion knowledge remained limited. Wounds refused to heal. Minor infections turned fatal. Japanese physician Dr. Terufumi Sasaki, working at the Red Cross Hospital, later described how wards filled with patients suffering mysterious decline. People who had survived burns and trauma began dying without visible cause. Entire groups admitted on the same day deteriorated simultaneously. Doctors slowly realized proximity to the explosion seemed connected to illness severity. Those closer to the hypocenter were more likely to develop these symptoms. Yet the mechanism remained unclear. By late August, Japanese scientists studying bomb debris concluded that radiation exposure was responsible. Survivors had absorbed intense gamma radiation and neutron exposure at the moment of detonation. Residual radioactive fallout continued affecting those who entered the city afterward. Death rates climbed sharply during late August and September. Some families lost members weeks after believing they had escaped the worst danger. Crematoriums struggled to handle the growing number of bodies. Funeral rites were often abandoned amid overwhelming loss. Photographers documenting the period captured scenes of patients lying outdoors under makeshift coverings. Many were wrapped in bandages, faces swollen from burns, skin scarred and peeling. Others showed no obvious injuries yet appeared exhausted, their bodies failing from within. In shelters across Hiroshima, fear spread. Survivors worried illness might be contagious. Rumors circulated that poisonous gases lingered in ruins. Some families avoided victims entirely, unsure how sickness spread. Meanwhile, American reconnaissance and intelligence teams collected information about the bomb's effects. Reports reaching Washington confirmed that the weapon's impact extended beyond blast and fire. Yet, global awareness remained limited. Japan surrendered on August 15th, ending the war before full understanding of radiation consequences emerged internationally. As occupation authorities entered Hiroshima in September, They encountered a population already suffering a second wave of catastrophe, one invisible and poorly understood. The realization that atomic weapons inflicted long-term biological damage marked a turning point. Warfare had entered a phase where destruction did not end when fighting stopped. And as international scientific teams prepared to investigate the city in greater detail, Hiroshima was about to become the world's first laboratory for studying nuclear warfare's lasting human consequences. By the autumn of 1945, Hiroshima had already become more than a battlefield casualty. The city was turning into the first place in human history where scientists, military officials, and governments confronted the long-term consequences of nuclear warfare. American occupation forces arriving in September found survivors still dying from unexplained illnesses. Many patients admitted weeks after the explosion showed symptoms doctors were only beginning to recognize: weakened immune systems, persistent infections, internal bleeding, and sudden collapse. Entire families that had survived the blast were losing members one by one. Reports soon reached Washington and scientific institutions across the United States. Military medical teams were dispatched to investigate conditions firsthand. Their task was both humanitarian and strategic. Understand what radiation exposure meant for future warfare. Joint Japanese-American research groups began collecting data. Doctors interviewed survivors, measured distances from the hypocenter, recorded injuries, and mapped survival patterns. They documented how buildings shielded some individuals while others exposed outdoors suffered severe radiation doses. In December 1946, U.S. authorities formally established the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission. Its headquarters eventually operated in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Researchers studied thousands of survivors, gathering medical histories, conducting examinations, and tracking long-term health effects. Yet this research created complicated emotions among survivors. Many Hibakusha believed they were being studied more than treated. Medical examinations were often conducted without providing direct care, partly due to research mandates and limited medical infrastructure. Survivors sometimes felt reduced to subjects of scientific curiosity rather than patients needing help. Photographs taken during these investigations revealed haunting realities. Survivors with severe keloid scars, thick, raised burn tissue forming months after injuries healed, became enduring symbols of radiation's physical consequences. Young women and children, their skin permanently altered, were photographed during treatment or recovery, images later circulating worldwide. Meanwhile, global political awareness of atomic power expanded rapidly. Newsreels and later publications introduced audiences to images of Hiroshima's destruction. Though censorship initially limited graphic detail, stories of radiation sickness gradually entered public discussion. Scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project themselves began expressing concern over nuclear weapons' future implications. In 1946, the United Nations established the Atomic Energy Commission to address nuclear control, reflecting growing international anxiety. Within a few years, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb, ending America's nuclear monopoly and launching the Cold War arms race. Hiroshima's tragedy thus transformed into a global warning. Governments realized future wars could involve weapons capable of destroying entire cities instantly while leaving survivors to suffer long after combat ended. For survivors themselves, however, daily life remained filled with uncertainty. Many experienced chronic illness, fatigue, or social discrimination. Employers hesitated to hire Hibakusha, fearing contagion or long-term weakness. Women faced difficulty marrying due to fears of genetic damage affecting children. Images of radiation victims began appearing in exhibitions, newspapers, and documentaries during the 1950s. Viewers encountered faces marked by burns, bodies weakened by illness, and children growing up under the shadow of invisible exposure. These images shifted global perception from viewing Hiroshima solely as military victory to understanding it as human catastrophe. By the time scientific understanding matured, the world had already entered the nuclear age. Weapons thousands of times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb were under development. And as nations stockpiled nuclear arsenals capable of ending civilization itself, Hiroshima's survivors carried forward memories that would shape how humanity understood the cost of atomic warfare. Consequences that would continue unfolding long after the ruins were cleared and cities rebuilt. By the end of 1945, Hiroshima's physical destruction was already visible to the world. What remained less understood was the scale of human loss still unfolding among survivors. Estimates compiled by Japanese authorities and later international studies concluded that approximately 70,000 to 80,000 people died instantly or within hours of the explosion. Yet, death did not stop there. Fires, injuries, and radiation sickness continued claiming lives for weeks and months. By the close of 1945, total fatalities in Hiroshima were estimated to have reached around 140,000 people, though precise numbers remain debated due to lost records and displaced populations. Those who survived faced conditions almost as severe as the bombing itself. Entire families had vanished. Children wandered refugee camps searching for relatives who would never return. Makeshift shelters filled school buildings and surviving structures. Food shortages persisted as infrastructure lay destroyed. Clean water was scarce, and disease spread easily in overcrowded conditions. Hospitals struggled to function. Doctors treated patients in corridors and outdoors, lacking medicine, equipment, and even basic bandages. Burn injuries required months to heal, often leaving permanent scars and restricted movement. Many survivors could no longer perform physical labor, making employment difficult in an already shattered economy. Radiation sickness continued claiming victims through late 1945 and into 1946. Survivors who appeared healthy suddenly collapsed. Funeral ceremonies became brief or impossible as crematoriums worked continuously. Families often buried loved ones without proper rites, amid exhaustion and grief. Psychological trauma compounded physical suffering. Many Hibakusha reported recurring nightmares, survivors' guilt, and anxiety. Some struggled with memories of searching through ruins for relatives or witnessing neighbors burn in collapsing homes. Mental health treatment, however, remained rare in post-war Japan. Rumors spread that radiation illness might be contagious. Employers hesitated to hire survivors, fearing long-term sickness or future incapacity. Women who survived faced discrimination in marriage prospects, as families worried exposure might cause birth defects in future children. Entire communities quietly carried this stigma. Some Hibakusha concealed their history to avoid rejection. Others relocated, attempting to start new lives away from reminders of the catastrophe. Meanwhile, Hiroshima itself began the slow process of rebuilding. Emergency housing projects emerged among ruins. Streetcars gradually resumed limited operation. Schools reopened in temporary buildings. Government reconstruction plans aimed to transform the devastated city into a symbol of peace rather than defeat. Yet recovery was uneven and painfully slow. Rubble removal alone took years. Many survivors lived amid ruins long after war ended, constantly reminded of loss. Foreign journalists and relief workers visiting Hiroshima during this period described a city suspended between destruction and determination. Children played among burned foundations. Street markets reappeared beside empty lots where neighborhoods once stood. Survivors struggled forward, even as illness and grief lingered. But while Hiroshima rebuilt physically, the broader consequences of the atomic bombing were only beginning to reshape global politics, military planning, and scientific research changes that would extend far beyond Japan and define international relations for decades. And as the world entered the tense early years of the Cold War, the legacy of Hiroshima spread into global decisions about nuclear weapons and humanity's future survival. In the years following Hiroshima's destruction, the atomic bomb reshaped not only one city, but the strategic balance of the entire world. What had begun as a desperate attempt to end a global war soon evolved into a defining force of international politics. In 1949, just 4 years after Hiroshima, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb. The United States no longer held exclusive control over nuclear weapons. An arms race began, fueled by mutual suspicion between former wartime allies, now divided by ideology and power. Nations soon developed weapons far more destructive than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Hydrogen bombs tested in the early 1950s possessed explosive power hundreds of times greater. Military planners imagined scenarios in which entire metropolitan regions could disappear within minutes. Civil defense programs emerged in many countries, teaching civilians how to respond to nuclear attack, even as experts quietly acknowledged survival chances were limited. Against this backdrop, Hiroshima's survivors became living reminders of what nuclear war meant beyond strategy and deterrence theories. Hibakusha organizations formed to support victims and advocate for medical assistance and compensation. Survivors shared testimonies with journalists, researchers, and eventually international audiences. Their stories shifted nuclear debate away from abstract military calculations toward human consequences. Medical studies continued as well. Long-term monitoring revealed increased cancer rates, particularly leukemia, among exposed populations. Research conducted through survivor data significantly advanced global understanding of radiation exposure, influencing safety standards in medicine, industry, and nuclear energy production worldwide. Reconstruction efforts turned the destroyed city into a symbol of peace advocacy. In 1955, Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park officially opened near the bomb's hypocenter. The preserved skeletal remains of the Industrial Promotion Hall, later known as the Atomic Bomb Dome, stood amid new buildings as a deliberate reminder of what occurred there. Each year on August 6th, ceremonies commemorated victims while calling for nuclear disarmament. Delegations from around the world visited the city, confronting history through preserved ruins, survivor accounts, and photographs documenting radiation's effects. These images, once censored or hidden, gradually entered textbooks, museums, and documentaries. Photographs of injured survivors, devastated neighborhoods, and children recovering from burns became permanent records of nuclear warfare's human toll. Yet global nuclear arsenals continued growing through the Cold War. By the 1960s, both the United States and Soviet Union possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other many times over. The concept of mutually assured destruction became central to military doctrine. Ironically, Hiroshima's destruction both demonstrated nuclear weapons power and helped prevent their future use. Fear of repeating such devastation, on a far larger scale, contributed to decades of cautious deterrence rather than direct superpower conflict. For survivors, however, Consequences remained personal rather than geopolitical. Men continued battling illness or discrimination well into old age. Others dedicated their lives to sharing memories, determined that future generations understand what nuclear war truly means. By the late 20th century, Hiroshima had become both a rebuilt modern city and a historical warning preserved in memory and imagery. The rare photographs documenting radiation effects were no longer hidden records, but part of humanity's collective consciousness. And as the world continued living under the shadow of nuclear weapons, the lessons drawn from Hiroshima's suffering remained unfinished, leading inevitably to a deeper reflection on what this moment revealed about war, technology, and the fragile future of human civilization. Hiroshima, in the wake of the atomic bomb, became more than a city. It became a mirror reflecting humanity's capacity for both innovation and destruction. The rare photographs capturing radiation's invisible wounds remind us that war's deadliest consequences are not always immediate. Some emerge slowly, in weakened bodies, in orphaned children, in the silence of devastated streets. The atomic bomb revealed a new dimension of human vulnerability. Destruction could now extend beyond blast and fire into invisible forces, altering health, genetics, and social structures for decades. Survivors bore scars that no city rebuilding could erase. Scars etched into flesh, memory, and collective conscience. Yet, from these ruins arose resilience. Hiroshima reconstructed itself physically and spiritually, preserving memory while advocating for peace. Survivors transformed their suffering into testimony, insisting that images of radiation's effects serve as lessons for generations who might otherwise forget the stakes of modern warfare. Globally, Hiroshima's tragedy reshaped geopolitics, science, and ethics. It forced the world to confront a reality in which human ingenuity could annihilate civilization in an instant. It challenged moral frameworks. Could victory ever justify the suffering of tens of thousands, many of them civilians, and countless generations thereafter? Ultimately, the rare images of radiation's aftermath endure as evidence and warning. They are reminders that war is no longer merely a contest of armies, but a confrontation with forces that extend beyond human perception and control. They compel reflection, empathy, and vigilance. The responsibility to ensure that such devastation is never repeated. Hiroshima's story does not end with its ruins. It continues in memory, in images, in the persistent voices of survivors, and in humanity's ongoing struggle to wield power wisely. From the shadow of fire and radiation emerges a profound, haunting lesson. The true cost of war is measured not only in lives lost, but in the invisible scars left on the living world.